start with something that you wrote in your introduction on the website. It was so lovely. In her own words, she says, "I grew up in the ancient city of Allahabad in a household that cherished literature and creativity. My parents shared a house with poets, animals, birds, flowers, and trees." My guest today is Mehr Farooqi. Mehr Farooqi is Associate Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. Meher's research interest lies in the literary culture of Northern Indian languages. She's also interested in bilingualism, translation, literary modernism, and intersections between religion and literature, history and art history. Mehr is the author of Urdu, Literary Culture, Vernacular, Modernity in the Writings of Muhammad Hassan Askari, and The Postcolonial Mind, Urdu Culture, Islam and Modernity, again in Muhammad Hassan Askari's writings. Mehr also authored the two-sided canvas Perspective on Ahmad Ali and 2 volumes of anthology of modern Urdu literature. Meher's book on Ghalib is A Wilderness at My Doorstep, a critical biography. And Meher's latest book, which is in printing, is also on Ghalib, his unpublished verses. Welcome, Mehr.
Thank you. Hi.
Much for taking out time for us this morning. So, Mehr, I will start with a very basic question. What is the difference between Hindavi, Dehelvi, and Urdu?
Well, Urdu is a name that was given to this language very late, 19th century probably. And Hindavi was the earlier name of the language, spoken language actually, that was used in the area around Delhi. So that is why Amir Khusro refers to it as the Hilvi, and then some other people do that as well. Primarily because it is the language of that region, the area around Delhi. So I would say Western, modern, Uttar Pradesh and India, that was the region where there was this hybrid language was created. And it continued to be called Hindi for a very, very long time until the British were, in the process of standardizing some, there was this process of standardizing languages that was going on in England as well. So English was being standardized. And Gilchrist and other people who were interested in Indian languages wanted to come up with the kind of standardized dictionary and things like that. And they were puzzled why this language was so free-flowing. And it also suited their interests to drive a wedge between, the 2 major religious communities in India. And so it made sense for them to call the language with the Devanagari script Hindi and then come up with another name, Urdu, for the same language. It's also drawn from the reference to Urdu-e-Mualla, that is the language of the exalted court, because once Persian was replaced by Urdu, Urdu became the language of the court. So those are the somewhat complicated, I would say, but I think we are safe in saying that it's the same language.
I see. Okay. So, Mehr, do you think that Urdu's rich vocabulary and a plural culture in which it exists is an effective medium for the many streams of ideas and diverse philosophies in the subcontinent?
Yeah, I mean, the more inclusive a language is, the more it borrows from other languages, like Urdu did from, the grammar of Urdu is Indic. it's not Persian, but it hybridized with Persian and through Persian with Arabic. So it has a lot of Arabo-Persian lexes. And the most interesting thing that happened with Urdu was that it took parts of Arabic, parts of Persian, parts of Indic language, and fused them together to make new words. So for example, a very common word like khubsurat comes from bringing together khub from Persian and surat from Arabic. It's not, khubsurat is not used in Persian. It's not Persian vocabulary. It's Urdu.
I see. How interesting.
Yes, and similarly taking dar, which means the possessor, and adding it to chokidar. There's a whole slew of words like that were created. So when the language becomes very innovative, it has the capability of expressing ideas. And the first Urdu translation of the Quran happened in 1773. It was a partial translation. So any language that gets to that level, that it's able to translate such a complex and vibrant text like the Quran, we can, think of it as having the capability of expressing all kinds of ideas.
And philosophies. I see. So, according to some estimates, Urdu / Hindustani is probably the third most widely spoken language in the world after English and Mandarin, of course. So, do you think the subcontinent can benefit from its vast reach and adopt it as a language, as the lingua franca, and to be able to reach out to the world?
Okay, so you see, with languages, there are many parts to what constitutes a language. The most essential thing is the grammar. So Hindustani and Hindi or Urdu, they have the same grammar. The second most important thing is the vocabulary. So in this respect, Hindi now has a very Sanskritized vocabulary and Urdu has a more Persianized vocabulary, but still they are intelligible languages. Now the third important thing is the script. So Hindi is now written in the Devanagari script and Urdu is written in what we call the Urdu script, which is Nastani. Of course, it has different styles, like, you can write it in Naskh, you can write it in Shikaste. But basically what we generally adopt is Nastali, which is a spiky script. So if you don't know the script, you can't really read each other. But learning the script is not very difficult. Because if you know the grammar, you're already prepared. You already have the apparatus to be able to read the script. Just as, like we started doing our Alif Bay from first to learn to read the Quran, and so it was very easy to switch from there to Urdu, because once you know the basics. But the problem of Hindustani is a little bit more thorny because of the script. So Hindustani, the common language, in what script should it be propagated? At one time, it was even proposed that it should be written in Romanized, script, like the script for English. But every language has characters that best represent its sounds. So, for example, khe. In Hindi, you have to put a dot under the letter kha to produce khe. For qaf, we have qaf, but in Hindi there's no qaf, so you have to put again a dot under ka to make it qa. And to accommodate the Indic sounds, what we did in Urdu was we had the do chashmi hai, and we used it to make gha, like gaf, and do chashmi hai becomes gha, dha, dal, and do chashmi hai becomes dha, and dha, and ra. These are all Indic sounds. So Urdu has a very, it has one of the most complicated and effective phonetic system, and that was accomplished by doing this. So for Hindustani, I would think that as a spoken language, I would say that definitely it's very widespread. But as a written language, it gets split into the two scripts, and so it loses some of its constituency. But recently, I think there's more and more interest in people to learn both scripts. So I'm very hopeful.
Oh, really? That's very nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Usually,
I'm hopeful.
Yeah. So, usually a culture develops a language and enriches its nuances. But in the case of Urdu, do you think the language affects the cultures in which it exists? Because of its, that's something that we have in mind about Urdu, something that we have in our subconscious mind about Urdu, that affects the culture in which it exists, wherever it goes.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So languages like Urdu and Persian and Arabic also, they have a very sophisticated formal side to them. So I would say the pronoun aap, for example, in Urdu, we use that when we address people who are senior or whom we respect. And that can't be replicated by you, because you is just tum. There's no aap in English. Similarly, there is a whole protocol, there's a whole culture of speech. For instance, I would say tashrif rakhiye instead of baithiye. I mean, both are available to me, but I would use one or the other depending who I'm talking to. So this kind of sophisticated urbane culture was nurtured by Urdu because of its hybridity, because of its richness. And this has a lot of appeal across generations. So I would think that, of course, it is a given that languages are born of a culture, and then they influence the culture in which they are growing. In Urdu, there has been a revival of this cultural part of Urdu. So there are many people who just love Urdu, mostly for the Urdu culture, and it has. I'm so happy to say that there's been a lot of not just interest, but actually people are learning. People are enrolling in classes and learning how the ins and outs of this culture.
Oh, that's so interesting to know. Do you think the next generation, our next generation, is missing out on their heritage but not using Urdu language as much as they should, or living in that culture that Urdu produces around itself? Also, do you think the post-colonial mind in South Asia, where does it place Urdu? And is that the reason the new generation is so far away from this language?
Yeah, this is a very good question. It has to do with, of course, the post-colonial mind and the imprint of English and the systematic putting down of all the regional languages in South Asia, not just Urdu. I mean, it was done to just name the language, for example, Punjabi, in the South, because South was more insulated. Perhaps Tamil and Malayalam might have escaped it, but still English made very heavy inroads because of the curricula, because it was introduced in schools at an early stage, and also because the curriculum reflected but we were reading Wordsworth, Milton, Shakespeare. Not that they are bad poets, but we were not reading Khusro or Kalidas or Ghalib. So generations grew up without being introduced to their own classical heritage. And that was the biggest blow that all languages, not just Urdu, received in the post-colonial sort of world. Thinking about this in the present context, I would say that there should be a more active program, I would say, in bringing up Urdu more with the modern vocabulary. So technology has brought to us a whole slew of words, mostly coming from English. And we have been a little lagging behind or lazy in coming up with our own vocabulary. What we tend to do is that we just borrow the word from English, and often a sentence in Urdu can be speckled with so many words from English, even when we don't need those words at times. We tend to use those words. So a careful attempt by scholars, the young scholars, to come up with glossaries, to come up with word lists that they can relate, so that we can educate ourselves and bring ourselves more up to date with Urdu in the world of technology. The rest of the challenges that the modern world has imposed on us.
I see. Okay. Urdu is a language which is a very lyrical, poetic, romantic language, a very sophisticated language. But it has also been a very effective language as a voice of protest. So at the popular level, it is a language, very appropriate for film songs. But it's a language which is very, very effective in protesting and in the voice of dissent. So please comment on that. Do you think any other language has that quality?
I can only comment on Urdu, and so what happened in Urdu culture was that the poet, because poetry was ranked very high. I mean, not just Urdu, I would say, starting from all classical languages, poetry was ranked very high in the order of knowledge, and the poet because of creativity. So because poetry and creativity go hand in hand, and because creation is a godlike activity, right? Leela, it's God, when gods play, then the world is created. So similarly, when poets play, poetry is created. So because of the creative power of poetry also had the license to be subversive. Poets also had them. So you have all our Urdu poets, Ghalib, you name, and they could say things in poetry which you couldn't really say in prose. So, for example, I mean, just pick up any that you could express yourself in poetry. So, because of this freedom, poetry then became also the language of protest. When it came to protesting, for example, against the brutality of the colonial state. And, Inqilab Zindabad, Sarfaroshi ki tamanna, ab hamare dil, etc. And there's a whole slew of protests. Because it is so musical, the form of the ghazal as a genre has so much musicality in it. It's all this end rhyme scheme, meter, and then the play with words. All of this makes it very, very free-flowing. So, Ravani, a lot of Ravani in Urdu, and that's why it also becomes exciting emotions.
I see. May you tell us about Ghalib? Ghalib published just one divan, and His unpublished works that you've been working on and researching on in Persian and in Urdu is as beautiful, as evocative, as powerful. Why did he not publish those works?
You know, this is a question that I've been grappling on for the last almost 10 years now, and I think I sort of have an answer to it. The reason is that Ghalib was a difficult poet, difficult in the sense that he liked to use, he had lots of ideas, and he liked to make them as complicated as possible and as complex as possible. And he wasn't therefore a very successful mushaira poet. He always had this complaint that people didn't understand his verses and they wanted him to write simpler poetry. So when he had this opportunity to print his first divan in Urdu, he very carefully went over his whole earlier divan that was in 1821, and he took out verses that were obscure. In doing this, he sometimes made mistakes and took out some really good verses as well. But by and large, he was a very capable and very meticulous editor of his own work, which is very, very rare, because generally we rely on someone else to be the editor of our works. You know, like I would like you to read my book and tell me where I am, you know, going off the topic. But what Ghalib did was that he prepared an intikhab first in 1828 for his friend Maulvi Sirajuddin in Calcutta. And in Calcutta also he saw that the world of print was booming everywhere. And people had access to printed work, printed word more readily than they had to manuscript. So when he came back from Calcutta, he was all fired up and he decided that he would actually publish his Urdu divan. But he knew that if he published all those esoteric verses and it would be a thicker volume, maybe it won't be as successful, just as his mushaira poetry wasn't successful. So he came up with this brilliant idea of selecting, you know, a very smartly, he actually cut it in half practically. And so what we have as Divan al-Ghalib, the first time it was published was in 1841. And it went through many, many editions, but he added very little new verses to it. Mostly what he added was his more newer compositions, because as he grew older, you know, he matured as a poet also. And in the meantime, he was also writing in Persian. So his desire to write very heavily Persianized Urdu was sublimated by writing actually in Persian. So when he comes back to Urdu after 20 years, for 20 years he didn't write anything in Urdu, just wrote in Persian.
Oh, I see. Is his Persian work read in the Persian world, in the Persian-speaking countries? Do they read him?
Not much, because again, his Persian, though he claims to have native ability in it,
Mehr, please come closer to the mic, please. Thank you.
Yes. So his Persian, is it better?
Yes, I think it's better now.
Okay. So what happens is that because Ghalib's exposure to native Iranian speech was limited, because by the time you get to the 19th century, the immigration from Iran had become a trickle. There were fewer emigres for him to interact with. That's why he came up with this idea of a tutor, whose name was, he says, people say it was a made-up person. There wasn't any person named Abdul Samad Hurmuz, because Ghalib wanted to show that he was actually trained in Persian by a Persian native. So he came up with this idea. I mean, I don't know, I haven't been able to find any concrete proof that there was a person like Hormuz, but that's what Ghalib claimed later on. So what happened was that his Persian also was regional, you know, Indian in that way. And a lot of Indian words and usages had gotten absorbed into Persian. So just as Urdu absorbed a lot of Persian, Persian absorbed also Indic So it's
So
very interesting. And
interesting.
what happened in India was that, yeah, it's all very, so my book goes into all these are all very new ideas and research that I have excavated. So what happens in India is that a lot of dictionaries are being produced because people are learning Persian in order to get jobs at the court, language of the court till 1837. So so how do you learn a language? Through a dictionary, right? You need to have dictionaries or lexicons as they were called because they have lists of words. So when you are making those lists, when Indians are making those lists, Indian scholars, they're obviously including more and more Indian words. Just as Oxford, OED has so many Indian words in it, right? So similarly, all the dictionaries that were produced in India, and there were so many of them, they brought in a lot of Indian words into Persian. So Ghalib's Persian is not very easy for Iranians to understand. You need to sit down with the dictionary. Yeah. So although Diwan Ghalib Dehlvi, I have his Persian Diwan published from Iran.
Oh, interesting. So this is a translation of Diwan Ghalib?
Yes, Persian from Iran.
Okay. Very.
Yeah. So he did get published there, but really not much. I mean, people, the main Persian scholars, they like Iqbal, they like Khosrow, they even like Baydil, but Ghalib seems very foreign to them.
I see. All right. Tell us something about Ghalib's life that you found in your research, which people don't know about. Something interesting that you discovered.
Yeah. So Ghalib's birthday. We generally think that he was born in December 1797, but it's not really a definite date because it doesn't tally with many of the events in his life.
Oh.
So, for example, if we keep on going backwards to his father and to his grandfather and to the dates when his grandparents got married, when his parents got married, it doesn't, and that he was married, Ghalib himself was married at the age of 13. Those dates don't match. So it's likely that he was maybe 4 years older than what his date of birth is. So that's my contribution in it after going through a lot of research.
But that's very important.
Probably 17 at least when he got married, if not older than that, not 13, and so on. So that's one of the things that I found. I also saw that his Persian is the corpus is 5 times as much as his Urdu.
Oh.
So yeah, it's immense. It's huge. And he never produced an intikhab of his Persian. Really, I mean, he did it for his friends, but he never published, the Urdu Diwan is the same thing for his Persian. So this is also an interesting question to think about. And it sort of puts us to think about the importance of cosmopolitanism, the reach of a language, which is what you began this interview, right? You sort of, we talked about how the Hindustani has so many speakers and Hindustani is the 3rd biggest language in the world. So now we have to go back and then think in those days, was Urdu then as widely spoken as Persian was, or not? So Persian is a classical and a living language, and its reach was very beyond the borders of South Asia. Ghalib, obviously, like Iqbal later on, must have realized that Persian would probably bring him wider acclaim, and Urdu would be something that would be restricted to the
subcontinent or India. Yes.
Yes. So he produced a lot in Persian. He most of his early letters, all of them are in Persian. Only after 1840, I think that's the first letter, but it's very hard to get. But I would safely say after 1848 that he began to write letters in Urdu. Earlier, all his letters are. That's why, you know, much of his early life is not really meticulously researched, because Persian learning knowledge is not as uh, rigorous as it used to be in, you know, in South Asia. But it is again on the uptick, because Indo-Persian has become a subject that people are taking a lot of interest in. Scholars are interested in Indo-Persian. So much more will come out from digging around in the Persian archives about Ghalib.
Do you think you have many Persian scholars now looking into Ghalib's work in India?
I wouldn't say in India. In India, there has been a lot of work on his Urdu divan, and also on his letters in Urdu, because those letters have been annotated and published in 5 volumes. So the Urdu letters constitute 5 volumes. The Persian letters also constitute 3 volumes. I mean, just imagine the productivity of this guy, how much he was writing.
Absolutely. Amazing.
It's amazing. And I also, in my book, I mentioned that if his Urdu letters hadn't survived, and the reason why they survived is that even in his lifetime, people wanted to publish them. So this proposal was made. Otherwise, you know, the Urdu Divan is so slender. That would have been all that remained of him if his Urdu letters had not been published. Really, it's such a fascinating story.
It is, absolutely.
We should just do a program just on Ghalib.
Just on, absolutely. Absolutely. I was just wondering that Mehr hasn't been studied as much as Ghalib has. People have had more interest in Ghalib. So, and it goes on. I think even, you know, in the future, people will be researching on Ghalib.
Yeah.
Enigmatic personality.
Right.
Anyways.
Yeah. And also he's born at the, you know, the crossroads of history. His position at the crossroads, you know, that at the time when language is becoming 6 years old, I would say, want to push it further, maybe 450 years. So in the terms of language, it's still a young language. And a lot of the early Urdu writing was in poetry form. Prose made a very late entrance, because even, you know, the tazkiras were all written in Persian very late, you know, Urdu tazkiras come into play. So Persian prose, once Persian prose is replaced and Urdu prose comes in, the novel is preceded by the dastan, which is a phenomenal you know, event in Urdu. All these stories and dastans, and then novels start coming out. Have Nazir Ahmad, Nazir Ahmad. Then we have, of course, Ruswa, Raujan Atta. We have big novels coming up, but then there is a sort of a plateau, and that is, I think it's pretty interesting. No one has really explored it deeply enough, because what happens is that the novel takes a back seat and the short story comes in. So have large number of short stories being written. I mean, Premchand is a remarkable individual who wrote novels and short stories, but then otherwise you see mostly writers focused on the short story, and they didn't write big novels. Novels are fewer and far between in Urdu, but partition was an event, a cataclysmic event that gave Urdu writers again the opportunity to write novels, but not many novels really were produced. on partition, more short stories were produced. I think that with the partition having solidified, it took 2 or 3 decades for that to happen. So even though partition happened in 47, the distinctiveness of cultural identity between India and Pakistan took many, many more years. And after that happened, then the story of the nation comes into its own. So in Pakistan, we have novels. History does play a very, very significant role in the development of language. And the genres, I would say the genres, choice in genres is really, really important and influenced by history. Definitely.
Mehr, what future do you see for Urdu language in a geographical place which is very far from its origins of birth, where Urdu took birth, like in North America? There is a large of South Asian population. Do you see Urdu language taking birth in North America at some point in time and evolving as a language?
Wow. That would need a lot of speculation on my part. So I don't think that's going to happen. But what is happening is that a lot of significant work is being produced in America from scholars who are given the space to produce these writings and who are given the opportunity to nurture students who are interested in Urdu. For example, I teach a class called Ongoing Mehfil. I don't get a lot of students in it, but I get at least 10 students, and I give them the liberty to write their papers for the class in English, but of course we read in Urdu, and they're producing very, very insightful work, because they are, you know, as we have been discussing, they are in this zone of in-betweenness, cultural in-betweenness. So they see things with new and fresh eyes. And I really, really enjoy reading the papers that my students write about Ghalib, about me, about Iqbal. I mean, they have such fresh insights on these poets. Also, the American students, you know, I mean, like the Caucasian students who take Urdu, they take it with a passion. So they learn to speak, to read and write Urdu, and write about it with a lot of rich cultural hybridity being brought into it. So I feel there is an interest in, there is interest in different aspects of Urdu, maybe not just Urdu literature just by itself, but so I'll give you an example of what I've been doing, that I provide a running commentary on performances of ghazals being sung. So I share the stage, there's a singer who does the singing, and I do the in-between part of explaining what exactly the beauty of this particular poetry is, and it makes it so much more appealing to the audience. And then the audience, therefore, is not just South Asians, but you know, it's a very cosmopolitan audience. And so there are musicians in it, poets in it, there are all kinds of. So the cultural expansion of growing. I can't vouch for the language per se as people, you know, becoming literate in Urdu.
Yeah. Can you tell us about your upcoming book?
Oh, okay. So I was, I actually began writing 2 books on Ghalib at the same time. And this happened because I first started by focusing on the Mustarad Kalam, that is the work, that is the poetry in Urdu that Ghalib did not include, which I just told you is 50% of his Urdu poetry, not included. So I began with that, and very soon, I would say, like a year or 2 into the project, I started to think about the questions as to why did he do this and why didn't he do this and why he included this and why he excluded that. And I discovered that if we look at the different manuscripts of Ghalib, Diwan manuscripts, starting with 1816, that is the first one we have. Then we have the next one, which is 1821, and we have a third one in 1826, and then after that we have actually an intikhab that he did for a friend, which is called Gulerana in 1828, and then from after that there's a jump, and in 1841 you have this first, that is what we know as Diwan-e-Ghalib. So I found that you could actually study the progress from one Diwan to the other, and I realized that every Diwan is its own entity. So that's when the idea of writing a literary history of Ghalib came to my mind. And I started the second book, which is called A Wilderness at My Doorstep, which now has become the first book. It's funny, the second book became the first book. Anyway, so I call it A Wilderness at My Doorstep because most people just don't know about. I mean, everyone recognizes Ghalib, but most people don't know these very broad facts that he excluded 50% of his work, and his version is 5 times more than his Urdu. So, A Wilderness at My Doorstep looks into all these features of writing in 2 languages, of giving preference of one over the other. Why did he give more preference to his Persian than to his Urdu? And then the irony being that his everlasting fame is in Urdu, not in Persian, right? So my first book is titled, actually I'm toying with different titles for it. Probably I'm thinking of Ganjina Imani, that is A Treasure House of Meanings. A treasure house of meanings, because many people, what I found is that the verses that are mustarad are mostly from his early phase, and so they are representing to us the young Ghalib. Right. Especially if you are as prolific as Ghalib was. So what you are writing at age 13, the way you are writing at age 13, and the way you are writing at age 53 is different. You are more polished at age 50. You are more, you can do more with the language at that point than what you can do in earlier phase. So the second book goes into looking at this, the voice, Ghalib's voice when he was young, and Ghalib's mature voice. Both these projects are very close to my heart and very, very, I've given so many talks and lectures and papers. It's just so fascinating to unravel the meanings. That's why I call it Ganjina Imani, because it's a 2-line verse, and you can count the number of words, right, in a share. So in, let's say, 20 words, you have so much meaning which is compressed in it. And by using the right tools, by knowing how Riayat-e-Lafzi works, or how, the relativity of one word to the other, you can unearth and you can feeling layers of meaning. And that is what is so fascinating for me in my pursuit of Ghalib. that there isn't a moment of, blah. There is no blah with Ghalib. Because even if I've read a ghazal 100 times and I'm reading it 101 first time again, I can see something new in it. I can find something else to think about. Yeah, it is.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mehr. Ladies and
Thank
gentlemen,
you.
this is brilliant, Mehr Farooqi. Mehr, this was lovely.